A glance in the mirror. Chapter 14. Wives and Mothers. The Harrow Colosseum, as with all large theatres of the day, was resplendent in gold paint and red velvet cloth, the carpets thick and lush, and the seats soft and springy. They were all covered in red velvet, with gold-headed nails. It represented high Victorian design, mouldings and motifs, statues, niches, and plaster cornicing. Queen Mary opened the theatre in 1940 in College Road, Harrow. The auditorium, circles and boxes were designed to seat 2,000 patrons in luxury. The theatre was closed 15 years later in 1955. The original site was a 1922 cinema founded by the owners of Hammer Films, whose doors opened to the public in 1923 to great acclaim. The local authority greenhouses and gardens nurseries were situated in West Harrow Park. It's important to explain that parks, gardens and walks were under the authority that maintained and stocked their gardens, verges and beds. To be able to do this, there was an organised nursery system, large enough to cope with all their needs. It was on a grand scale, overseen by the head gardener. His position was guaranteed by his previous experience, upheld by the gardeners below him, maintaining a high standard. All the borough's flower beds were immaculate, every bit as good as those seen at large holiday resorts on the coast. A competition was held by all the parks as to who is the best each year. This prize was eagerly sought after, and suitable notices and reports made in the local newspapers. This was the only way a gardener could apply for an advanced position, if he could show how well his gardens performed in competition. West Harrow Park had a paddling pool that provided space for those keen enough to sail their own model boats. The park held the local tennis courts and bowling green, as well as providing a bandstand. The park was for perambulating, not for children's games, or running about or cycling. The grass was perfect, and the flower beds a riot of perfectly formed colour and floral design. Headstone Manor Park was home to Besborough Cricket Ground, circled by stately elms. And Pillar Park had a fountain, and streamside walk meandered beside the River Pin, bridged over to allow movement along the further bank. All these local parks were perfection of horticultural splendour, policed by park keepers who stopped children running about, cycling or walking on the grass. They were places for peace and quiet, providing seating for contemplation and rejuvenation. The shops in Harrow, North Harrow and Pinner represented most of the popular trading outlets of the time. Harrow had the largest department store in Soapers, which was very similar to today's superstores, and Burton's, the 50-shilling tailors. North Harrow had Home and Colonial, and Lipton's, both grocers, who sold most provisions other than fruit and vegetables. There was United Dairies selling milk products and cakes, as did Express Dairies, Lists and Garner's the bakers, Cooper's the hardware store, Maynard's making and selling sweets from tall jars, Woolworth's the threepenny and sixpenny stores, and the cooperative stores with their pneumatic check-in system, part of a large chain that operated a half-yearly dividend payout system, and W. H. Smith's the stationers, awash with diaries and calendars. Pinner had Sainsbury's, which always suggested quality. Many of the items at the grocers were sold loose, that had to be weighed and bagged. Other popular brands were displayed prominently using brand colours and designs, and these were most fashionable and the store's major sale items. At the cheese counter, the blocks of cheese were cut up and weighed, as was bacon and ham. The backs of the counters against the rear wall were lined with shelves and cupboards displaying their wares. The counter displayed with marble slab, knife block, weighing machine, coffee grinder, wrapping paper and string. All these shops were most particular, aimed at to have the best shop fitters furnish their counters and facades. Their house styles always the same in whichever town they resided. Nothing was ever poorly made or shoddily equipped. They relied upon good service and politeness to ensure customers returned. Mothers had no fear about leaving their prams outside. In fact, the pavement would be littered with prams dotted about as their owners dived from shop to shop. Each main thoroughfare had a red public telephone box where, for twopence, a call could be made to any location. The telephone had a direct line to the operator, who took each call, placing the asked-for number by her dial-up system. Each main road had a convenient blue police box that had a direct line into the police station. Normally the policeman on his beat would call into the station to make regular reports. There was also a special telephone at the side for the public to make an emergency call to the station operator. Policeman, the only man to have the right time, could be seen at any time of day and night on his beat, checking all the doors and windows, the padlocks on the gates, standing in the shadows of a shop doorway, ever vigilant, being aware that the sergeant would be cycling past, checking up on his whereabouts. The nearest police station was housed at the top of the hill, opposite the Langham Cinema, at the end of the shops. Housewives generally had 2 mornings during the week set aside for shopping, say Tuesdays or Fridays. Wednesdays the shops were closed for half-day opening. The Friday shop had to carry the housewife over the weekend, for very few husbands shopped for groceries, children's underwear and toiletries. They condescended to look after providing for the children's top clothes in the main school uniforms purchased in Harrow. Elsie decided to take part in the government's vitamin welfare scheme. The boys had a daily spoonful of cod liver oil and malt, which was free for children under 2. Years later the cod liver oil scheme was changed to one of concentrated orange juice to supplement the vitamin C intake. At school the boys had 1/3 of a pint of milk, thought beneficial for health, particularly for the intake of vitamin D to prevent rickets. The government started to introduce new measures to support the country's agriculture and farmers' income. Guaranteed prices bolstered up the production of sugar beet and wheat. Meat production was treated in the same manner. The Agricultural Marketing Act of 1928 had promoted the standardization of different grades of produce and its packaging. The Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food introduced the National Mark, a trademark to label British-produced food, indicating a defined quality in egg production, beef, apples and pears. The Agricultural Marketing Act of 1933 advised farmers to form cooperatives, out of which came marketing boards for hops, potatoes, milk, bacon and pigs. The Import Duties Act of 1932 placed an import charge on most foreign-produced foodstuffs. In 1936, the rent tithe charged for farmers was abolished. The following year saw a scheme introduced to subsidise the spreading of lime on agricultural land to replace some of the minerals lost through planting. A year before World War II started, the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries was given powers to regulate and open up dormant land, to regulate the cultivation and management of land, end tenancies, take possession of badly cultivated land, and to order the use of previously difficult land to plough, and which include water meadows. There is little doubt that the level of nutritional content of the average British diet wasn't high. The home-produced vegetables were good and produced with little or no chemical fertilizers. The locally grown fruit was also grown without an abundance of pesticides. The problem was in the cooking, the amount of highly processed sugar and the amount of salt, mainly as a preservative. Many families used the produce growing in the hedgerows. Allotments gave what the roadside banks didn't. The amount of cigarette and pipe smoking was high and about to go even higher. Drinking sweet tea, sweetened bottled coffee and sweetened fruit juices complemented the smoking. The level of sweets eaten was also high, particularly for children. It was normal fare to consume very sweet puddings rather than eat fruit or yogurts. Meal times in the home were not only formal, but again followed a set routine. The pattern followed on from past generations. Neighbours, friends and acquaintances all conformed. During the week, breakfast was bread and butter and jam, perhaps a boiled egg with tea. Coffee was never drunk, marmalade not eaten, and toast never served. At the weekends, a fried breakfast of egg, bread, mushrooms and bacon may be on the menu for Sunday. Saturdays would be the same as weekdays. Most men worked at least the morning shift. Dinner was an evening meal during the week and midday at the weekends. In general, this was a cooked meal consisting of a roast meat and 2 veg variety, with a pudding, usually with a pastry base, with custard or milk. Bread would always be available, cut as needed from the board. Tea was only served after washing up completed. In the country, puddings and sometimes were served first to take away the pangs of hunger. Tea at the weekends was the most formal meal, with sandwiches, cakes and tea. The bread and cakes would be stood on a doily and the jam covered by a bead-fringed net. The butter was in its dish. The tea would be served during the meal, the cups being passed round the table. Supper was at 9 and laid on the table, maybe a cheese sandwich with tea. The washing was done in a round zinc bath on the gas stove, to be boiled. From there it was taken to the sink to be rinsed, then mangled and hung on the line. Some of the man's shirts, cuffs and collars would be starched, and on occasions a blue bag used to whiten the whites. The family's washing was always done on Mondays, if not raining. Tuesdays the washing was dried off. Wednesdays it was ironed. Thursdays aired, and Saturday put away for Sunday, a day of leisure. This household routine was carried out religiously, including dusting and sweeping, vacuuming and polishing. The majority of homes had this or a somewhat similar list routinely carried out. It not only got things done, but allowed friends and neighbours to call at an appropriate hour, to drop in for a cup of tea and a chat at a reasonable hour, when it was normal to have an hour to spare in the afternoon before the children came home from school, and this happened round about 4 o'clock. Girls were seen to be future wives and mothers. This is not a cliché, but a matter of fact. It is what they talked about, dreamt of doing, and fantasized about. That is not to say that they didn't have a job after leaving school, or that a number didn't go on to a higher education. If society viewed women as mothers and wives, in general, that was their goal. Girls, particularly the lower classes, did the things their mothers had done before. It was a normal course of action. When married with a family, this controlled their freedom to alter their status. There was neither home care, kindergartens, or spare time work. It was normal for a lone parent to reside with the married daughter when the children left home. As society changed, as much to do with world wars as evolution, so did women's relationship to their children. Those women who wanted a different lifestyle, at least in their formative years, gradually had the opportunity of doing so. What changed was their view of themselves. Gradually, they reached out to take on a range of jobs that would allow them to have independence, a chance to select for themselves their own lifestyle, when they were to have children, when to have sexual relationships, either casual or long-lasting. And this came about in the 50s. There were little improvement in women's legal status, employment and social freedoms. Elsie accepted her position because she had grown into it, was doing what her mother had done. She did not question it or rise up against it. being subservient in practically all things. There was greater regimentation. People tended to observe accepted modes of behaviour adopted from the previous generation. Household routines were commonly observed. The lives of the inhabitants had a pattern dictated by convention and habit. Mothers pushed their babies in coach-built prams that had the ends hinged for the child to sit up. Sunshades as an essential requirement. No woman ever wore trousers or shorts. Men always wore a hat or cap, and these were lifted in greeting, removed when entering a building. Men and boys without headgear raised their hands to their forehead. Everyone stood to attention to sing the national anthem. The children had to stand to attention indoors when the anthem was played on the radio. If a funeral cortege passed in the street, everyone stood still, and again hats were raised. Similarly, on November the 11th, everything stopped for the 2-minute silence when the gun went off, and once again hats were removed. No one ever kissed in public or held hands. Men walked on the curbside when escorting women, opened all doors, offered their seat, preceded women upstairs, and led them down. Etiquette, manners, politeness, and respectful behaviour were the hallmarks of a well-raised child. Children were only to speak when spoken to. If an answer required, then it had to be brief and to the point. The elder were given preference when queuing. Mothers and babies came second, men followed on. Table manners were taught and rigidly observed. Plates were offered round the table, teacups passed about. Cutlery never crossed when the table set. There was no talking whilst eating, and mouths were kept shut while chewing. Elbows off the table, only wrists rested beside the plate. Soup eaten, passing the spoon through the soup away from the body, and children sat up straight and were told not to slump. Serviettes laid on their lap, and after the meal returned to their ring. Sundays was a day of rest. No shops, cinemas or theatres were opened. Albert didn't allow the children to play cards or play outside in the streets on the Sabbath. Stanley and Terence had to attend church in their Sunday best. Shoes had to be polished, including the insteps, and long socks kept up with an elastic garter. To make the leather soles last longer, metal blakies or studs were hammered in. Ties were an essential part of the dress, as were caps. Pockets were for your handkerchief and small change, not for warming your or resting the hands. No one thought of walking under ladders. Any spilt salt needed a pinch thrown over the left shoulder to stop having bad luck. Number 13 was never used, and number 3 would bring success. Crossed cutlery would bring disaster, whilst having a black cat pass before one was good luck. Ancient sayings and even older natural cures prolificated. This ordered social behaviour only continued until late into the war, when they and many other conventions started to crumble.